Okay, Boker Tov, everybody. It's 11 a.m. in Toronto, 6 p.m. in Israel, where once again, it's really a wonderful thing that so many of our speakers live in Israel. Kimitzi on Teitzei Torah, our Tanach is based in Israel, so it's only appropriate that so many of our speakers are living in Israel. Channa Lockshin Bob teaches Gemara at Midreshet Adumim in Modi'in, where she lives, and she works in the Judaica collection at the National Library in Israel. She has taught at Midreshet Lindenbaum, and before she made Aliyah, taught at Drisha and Mayonat High School. And it's really, this is our first one in this series. It's a pleasure to have a father-daughter series. Dr. Lockshin, who's, taught Sefer Shmot right at the beginning of the program. So it's really wonderful that Midor Dor, and I guess an extra special treat that Channa, of course, grew up in Toronto. So we want to welcome and look forward to your class, which is today being sponsored by Debbie Sondheim in memory of her husband, Fred Distenfeld, a wonderful, loving, and unique individual who continues to inspire her and make her laugh. Vakasha, we look forward to Shir HaShirim, which is upbeat, I'd say, compared to Eov.
Absolutely.
Okay, Vakasha.
All right. So thank you so much for joining us for this Shir about Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs. And I want to start with two quotations about Shir HaShirim from two very different sources. The first one is by Robert Alter, the great Bible scholar and translator, in his book, The Art of Biblical Poetry. This is how he describes Shir HaShirim. Only in the Song of Songs is the writer's art directed to the imaginative realization of a world of uninhibited, self-delighting play, without moral conflict, without the urgent context of history and nationhood and destiny, without the looming perspectives of a theological worldview. Now, a lot of what Robert Alter is pointing out is stuff that we could have noticed on our own. For example, Shir HaShirim doesn't mention God. It doesn't mention even a single mitzvah. It doesn't mention even a single event from the Torah. And so Professor Alter basically says, look what Shir HaShirim is. It is just pleasure and joy without like any of the heavy religious stuff. Okay, now let's shift to a second quotation. This one is from the great mystical work, the Zohar, Sefer HaZohar. And the Zohar says as follows, the day that this song was revealed. I just want to point out that the Zohar is clearly picking up on the Mishnah in Masechet Yadayim, which had talked about the revelation of Shir HaShirim and the fact that Shir HaShirim is the holy of holies. And the Zohar says the day that this song was revealed was the same day that the Shekhinah descended to earth. So first of all, just that word revealed, right? We don't usually talk about like, Sefer Shoftim being revealed. We talk about Sefer Shoftim being written. So already Shir HaShirim is being basically put on par with the Torah, that it was like revealed in a special revelation. And it was this like momentous day in Jewish history. And now it describes Shir HaShirim. It is the totality of the whole Torah, the totality of the whole work of creation, the totality of the mystery of the patriarchs, of the exile in Egypt. And then I skipped the part where it goes on about everything that Shir HaShirim is the totality of, basically going through all of Jewish history until the ultimate redemption. And then finally, the Zohar concludes and says, whatever was, whatever is, and whatever eventually will be is all in Shir HaShirim. So basically, Robert Alter describes Shir HaShirim as having nothing Jewish and nothing spiritual about it, but the Zohar, on the other hand, says that Shir HaShirim is everything Jewish, and it's an the entire thing is spiritual. The whole book is the totality, I will say, using its word, of spirituality. So these are two different ways to look at Shir HaShirim, nothing religious or everything religious. And today I want to give our attention to both of those approaches. So the questions that I want to ask are, first of all, I want to explore what is the plain meaning, the pshat of Shir HaShirim? What's it actually talking about? Second, I want to take a look at What is the allegory of Shir HaShirim, the drash of Shir HaShirim? Now, I shouldn't actually use the word the when I'm talking about the allegory of Shir HaShirim, because in fact, there are many different allegories of Shir HaShirim, and we're only going to talk about one of them, which is the classic rabbinic interpretation of Shir HaShirim as being a love story between God and the Jewish people. And then the final question that I want to ask after we've explored both the pshat and the drash is what is something that both of them, the pshat and the drash, share with each other? Okay, so let's start by talking about the pshat of Shir HaShirim. The way I want to start by zeroing in on a few psukim from Shir HaShirim, just so that we can get a sense of get a sense of the flavor of Shir HaShirim. So I'm going to read some psukim. As I'm reading, I'm going to try to just point out things that are weird, things that stand out, and then I'll try after I read, I'll try after I read to sum up kind of the whole picture of what we're seeing. So I'm starting from chapter 1, right at the beginning. I'm going to read in Hebrew and translate. Yishakeni min shikot pihu. Ki tovim dodecha miyayin. Let him kiss me of the kisses of his mouth, for your love is more delightful than wine. Right away, notice a couple things. First of all, it's a female speaking, but who she's speaking to is somewhat confusing. At the beginning, she says, let him kiss me in third person, but then she says, for your love is more delightful than wine in second person. L'reach shemanecha tovim, shemen turak shemecha. Alkain alamot ahevucha. Your oil yields good fragrances, and your name is like good oil, and that's why the young women love you. Moshcheni acharecha narutza, heviani hamelech chadarav, nagila v'nismecha bach, nazkira dodecha miyayin, mesharim ahevucha. Pull me after you, and let's run together. The king has brought me to his chambers. We rejoice and are happy in you, in your love, savoring it more than wine. Like new wine, they love you. Couple of observations. First of all, there's like the wine and the oil. There's like a lot of kind of a sense of smell, a sense of taste. There's also this sense of like urgency and passion in the words, right? Yishakeni, moshcheni, right? Take me, kiss me, pull me. There's also the king appears here. The woman is describing the king bringing her into her chambers, which suggests that this is actually a love song between her and the king, except that now we're going to skip a few verses and see something a little bit different. Hagidali she'ahava nafshi, echa tir'eh, echa tarbitz batzahoraim, shalama eyek otia al edrei chaverecha. Tell me, you who I love so well, where do you pasture your sheep? Where do you rest them at noon? Let me not be as one who strays beside the flocks of your feathers. So now she's talking directly to the one that she loves, and it sounds like the one that she loves is in fact a shepherd. So what was up with the king beforehand? So we'll talk about that. But continuing in the psukim, Im lo te'ilach hayafa banashim, se'ilach be'ikvei hatzon. If you do not know, O fairest of women, go follow the track of the sheep and graze your kids by the tent of the shepherd. So it sounds like she's actually a shepherd also, right? She's grazing her kids also. So he's a shepherd and she's a shepherd, and they're kind of in this pastoral landscape trying to find each other. And we see that this is in fact, that Shir HaShirim is in fact a dialogue. Okay. So that was kind of our close reading of the psukim. A couple of things, sort of big adol, that we saw from this. First of all, that in general, what is Shir HaShirim? It is a dialogue between a female and a male part. In general, we refer to the female part as the ra'aya, and to the male part as the dode. We already saw the word dode here. Kitovim dodecha miyayin. JPS actually translates dode as beloved and ra'aya as darling, but basically meaning they're both the same. They're both words that mean the beloved. She is his beloved, he is her beloved, and those are the words that we use to refer to them. Another thing that we saw is this sense of like, there's joy in here, right? Nagila v'nismecha. There's passion in here. Moshcheni, this like sense of urgency about all of it. We notice the wine. There's this sense of being intoxicated, possibly with love. We also noticed a little bit of the senses in here, right? That immediately, right at the beginning, she makes a reference to the sense of smell. And in fact, in general, one of the things to be aware of in Shir HaShirim is that it really is a book that engages all 5 of our senses. So, for example, the sense of sound in Shir HaShirim is elaborated upon. She hears his voice, he hears her voice, and they together hear birdsong. The sense of sight is really important in Shir HaShirim. First of all, he describes her as beautiful, and she describes him as beautiful. But second of all, and even more, and it stands out even more, the Dode and the Ra'aya describe each other's bodies in great detail. I just gave a couple of examples in chapter 4. He describes her, he starts with her eyes and describes her whole body. He does it a couple of times in Shir HaShirim. And then in chapter 5, she also describes him. My beloved is clear-skinned and ruddy, and she also describes what he looks like. And they talk about looking at each other and each other's gaze and each other's glances. So there's a lot of kind of the importance of sight. Even more kind of sensually, the sense of taste is really important in Shir HaShirim. They describe drinking deeply of love and kind of the deliciousness of the experience of being together. The sense of touch, obviously, is very important. The Megillah starts with kisses. Let him kiss me. It continues to talk about embraces and other acts of love. And I saved for last because it is the biggest deal. The sense of smell is absolutely overwhelming in Megillat Shir HaShirim. Everything has a scent. The vine, everything, all of the plants and flowers and fruits that are blossoming are giving off scents. In chapter 3, verse 6, she is described as coming down from the desert, Olamin Hamidbar, Mikuteret Mor Ulevona. She's coming down from the desert in a cloud of myrrh and frankincense, that she's just in this like puff of delicious smells. He later describes himself going to the mountains of myrrh, to the hills of frankincense. And in chapter 4, verse 14, there's actually a catalog of like a whole list of spices. So if we take all of that together, all of those 5 senses, we can really see that Shir HaShirim overloads and overwhelms all 5 of our senses. Okay. So that's something that we know about Shir HaShirim. Let's talk about some of the things that we don't know about Shir HaShirim, some of the ambiguities that we saw in even just looking at those very few psukim. One big ambiguity is, who are the characters in Shir HaShirim? We saw both a reference to a king and a reference to a shepherd. So what's going on here? The most interesting kind of way to resolve this problem of who the characters are is the resolution of the Malbim, the 19th century Torah commentator, who suggests, and there are also academic scholars who suggest this, that in fact Shir HaShirim is a love triangle. This song recounts Shlomo loved one bride, the most beautiful of women, and shut her in his palace, and put the daughters of Jerusalem as guards around her. But she loved a shepherd in the desert. 5 times she escaped from the king's palace, to the desert to her beloved. So she's basically caught between these two people, the shepherd boy, who she truly loves, and the king who wants her, who's taken her to his palace and wants to marry her. The first 4 times, she was returned to the king's court, but the 5th time, they could not stop her. She left and never returned. Each song tells how she went out to the desert and united with her beloved. So according to the Malbim, the fact that some of the song is about a king and some of the song is about a shepherd, and also the fact that some of Shir HaShirim describes kind of city things, Benot Yerushalayim, the daughters of Jerusalem, and other kind of city things, and other parts describe this very pastoral scene, is because she is in fact going back and forth between 2 men in 2 very different settings. Now the Malbim is unique in this. Most of the other commentators who sort of try to give an interpretation of the simple meaning of Shir HaShirim say that there's only one main male character, and that main male character is a shepherd. And then what do they do with the references to the king? They say that they're basically metaphors. That when the Ra'aya is describing the Dode, she describes him as being like a king, just in order to sort of talk about how much she loves him and how much she adores him and how special he is. But it's not that there's an actual character of the king. It's just kind of an illustration of how she feels about him. But that actually brings us to really, I think, another major challenge in understanding Shir HaShirim, which is the issue of metaphors. Shir HaShirim uses so many metaphors that it's hard to know sometimes what is actually happening and what is in fact just a metaphor for something else, and which thing is a metaphor for which thing. So let me give an example here. There are lush landscapes in Shir HaShirim, but there are also allusions to the fact that landscapes might be a metaphor for the woman herself. For example, in Perek Daled, Pasuk Yud Bet, it says, the male part, the Dode says, "A garden locked is my own, my bride." Right? He describes her as being a garden. So then, every time that we read in Shir HaShirim that the lovers are walking through the garden, that the Dode is picking flowers in the garden, that the garden is blossoming, any of those things, we have to wonder, is this talking about a literal garden, or is this just all a metaphor for the woman? A second example. The man a couple of times talks about going to these fragrant mountains. You see in chapter 4, verse 6, "I will betake me to the mountain of myrrh, to the hill of frankincense." Now we just saw when we were looking at the sense of smell in Shir HaShirim, we saw that the woman is described as coming down from the desert in a cloud of myrrh and frankincense. So when he says that he's going to the mountain of myrrh and the hill of frankincense, does he possibly really, is that possibly really just a metaphor for the landscape of her body? And this question about these spicy mountains actually has a major nafkamina, a major upshot, which is what happens at the end of the Megillah. The very last pasuk of the Megillah, verse 8, chapter 8, verse 14, is Barach Dodi, Udemelech alitzvi ola ofer ha'ayalim al harei besamim. Hurry, my beloved, swift as the gazelle or a young stag to the hills of spice. She tells him to livroach, she tells him to run away to the hills of spice. So, depending on whether we think that the hills of spice are a literal place or a metaphor for her, based on that, we'll know whether the end of the Megillah is her sending him away, or whether the end of the Megillah is in fact her drawing him close to her. Okay, so that's one question about the use of metaphor in Shir HaShirim. But now, take everything that I just said about the landscape being a metaphor for the woman and turn it upside down. Let's look at some of these descriptions of the woman that don't necessarily make sense as descriptions of a woman and might make more sense as descriptions of a land. When the Dode is talking to the Ra'aya in chapter 4, he says to her, your hair is like a flock of goats streaming down Mount Gilead. Okay, I don't know about all of you, but I personally make a real effort to make sure that my hair isn't like a flock of goats. What's he saying here? Your neck is like the Tower of David. Is that a good thing? I don't know. In chapter 7, when he's describing her body, he says to her, your nose is like the Lebanon tower, the faces towards Damascus. I would not recommend trying that line with your dates. Doesn't sound like a compliment. And in fact, when you try to picture this woman whose hair is like a flock of goats and her neck is like the Tower of David and her nose is like the Lebanon tower, she doesn't sound like she looks like anybody you know. It doesn't sound like really a description of her body. But then if you think about how these descriptions have so many places in Israel that are part of them, then you start to wonder whether maybe these descriptions of her body belong less to the realm of biology and more to the realm of geography. Maybe really when he's describing the woman, he is in fact describing the beauty of the land of Israel and the desirability of the land of Israel. Look at how specific he gets with the places. You are as beautiful, chapter 6, verse 4. You are beautiful, my darling, as Tirzah, comely as Jerusalem, right? Generally, people don't look like a city, but a land could be compared to the beauty of Tirzah and the beauty of Jerusalem. So that maybe really all of this is actually a description of the land. And once you start reading through that lens, then when you get to chapter 4, verse 11, and it says, Dvash v'chalav tachat lishonech, honey and milk are under your tongue, you might start to wonder, is that a coincidence that the woman's mouth davka tastes like milk and honey? Or might it be that all of this is really a reference not to a person, but to the beloved land that is flowing with milk and honey? And in fact, everything that I just said now is part of, there really is kind of a modern, kind of usually Zionist inflected allegorical reading of Shir HaShirim as being a love song with the land of Israel. And I think that it's a pretty convincing reading because it really has a lot of basis in these descriptions. Okay. Here is something that I am putting on the screen, but I am not going to read out loud or go into too much. But it's something that you can take a quick look at, which is what it looks like when someone makes an attempt to outline the structure of Shir HaShirim. And what you can see is that it's really hard. It doesn't necessarily hold together as a single work. It might be more fair to Shir HaShirim to read it more as kind of a collection of poems on a theme, rather than something that's trying to be linear, that's trying to actually have a progression. There's so many things, they're not necessarily related to each other, right? We saw even at the beginning how like the first verse changed person in the middle. She was talking to the man about the man in third person, and then she starts talking about him to him in second person, and that in general there is something even dreamlike about Shir HaShirim where things shift, where the details shift very quickly, and where maybe we shouldn't look at that as a problem as much as sort of enjoy the poetry of it. And I think that what we should say about Shir HaShirim is that Shir HaShirim doesn't tell a story. It's not trying to tell a story. And in fact, it's hard to answer any of the basic questions, the basic kind of who, what, where, when, why kind of questions. It's hard to answer them when it comes to Shir HaShirim. But what Shir HaShirim is, what it powerfully does, is it conveys a state of being and a sensation and a feeling. The genre of Shir HaShirim is, of course, biblical poetry, but in some ways it's actually it's actually similar to another familiar Jewish genre, which is also freewheeling, evocative, and non-linear, which is midrash. We're going to talk in a minute about the Midrash on Shir HaShirim, but perhaps we could even say that the simple meaning of Shir HaShirim is itself a Midrash on love. Okay, so that's what I want to say about the simple meaning of Shir HaShirim. Now I want to talk about the drash, the allegorical reading of Shir HaShirim. Years ago, I gave a lecture about Shir HaShirim to a group of college students. And after the lecture, one young woman, a religious young woman, came over to me and said, "That was fascinating. I had no idea that Shir HaShirim was about that. I thought that Shir HaShirim was about Jewish history and God and the Torah and stuff like that." Now, it was obvious to me that this young woman hadn't engaged much with the original Hebrew of Shir HaShirim. As we saw, just looking at a few psukim from Shir HaShirim tells you that that's not what Shir HaShirim was about. But the other thing that was obvious to me immediately was that this woman's translation of choice for reading Shir HaShirim must have been the Art Scroll translation, because hiding the simple meaning of Shir HaShirim from readers is exactly what the Art Scroll translation is trying to do. Here's Rabbi Nassan Sherman in his introduction to Shir HaShirim from the Art Scroll Tanach. How is a love song holy? This question is perplexing only if Shir HaShirim is taken literally, but neither the sages nor the commentators do so. The song is an allegory. It is a duet of love between God and Israel. All agree that the true and simple meaning of Shir HaShirim is the allegorical meaning. The literal meaning of the words is so far from their meaning that it is false. Okay, so the literal meaning is false. Is that true? I want to read a passage of Shir HaShirim Rabbah with you, and we can see whether we think that that is in fact what the Midrash is trying to do, whether the Midrash really is a replacement for the simple meaning that we learned. The passage that I want to read is from chapter 7. Chapter 7 is, again, one of the places that the Dode describes the Ra'aya. He, in fact, describes her from her feet to her head, kind of looking at her from the bottom up. And so the Midrash, of course, as Midrash does, starts by quoting the Pasuk and then offers its commentary. I'm going to kind of offer my comments as we go. How lovely are your feet in sandals? That's the Pasuk. Rabbi Yudan said, were a common person to offer praise in this sort of language, it would be insulting. Yet you say, how lovely are your feet? So this particular line actually sounds like exactly what the Art Scroll was getting at, which is the idea that there's potentially something problematic in Shir HaShirim, that how can we start commenting on the way that a lady's legs look? How does that belong in a holy book? It's something that, like, if a common person were to say it to you, you would consider it sexual harassment. It would be insulting. This is not okay, says Rabbi Yudan, and therefore he offers an alternate explanation. Rather, it is only talking about the feet of those approaching Jerusalem for the gathering holidays, meaning it's not about regalim, it's not about raglaim, legs, it's about regalim, the pilgrimages to Yerushalayim during the three major holidays. Moving along, verse 3, your navel is like a round goblet. That's the verse. The Midrash says this refers to the high court, the Sanhedrin. Just as an infant, as long as he is in his mother's stomach, is sustained only through his navel, so Israel cannot do a single thing without their high court. So the first one, there was kind of this little wordplay of regalim and raglaim, but this time it's more kind of just a description of sort of a belly, and kind of a belly having to do with sustenance. And so the Sanhedrin is something that is sustenance. Continue, oh, that was the navel, now the belly. Your belly is like a heap of wheat. This refers to the priestly book of Leviticus, Sefer Vayikra, Torah Kohanim. Just as the stomach has the heart above it and the legs below it and is in the middle, so Leviticus has 2 books before it and 2 books after it, and it is in the middle. So it's just kind of associative, right? Bellies are in the middle, Vayikra is in the middle. Here's a little bit from verse 5. Your eyes are like pools in Cheshbon. Your eyes refers to the high court, the Sanhedrin, which serves as the eyes of the community. Okay, wait a minute. Who is the Sanhedrin? Is the Sanhedrin the navel, or is the Sanhedrin the eyes? So I want to say a couple things about this passage in general. First of all, the beginning of it does imply that the simple meaning of the text is problematic. However, everything else about the Midrash is so closely bound in the original meaning that it's hard to understand it without it, right? The whole idea of the high court being sustenance is because it's associated with the navel. And the whole idea of Leviticus being in the middle is because it's associated with the belly. If you took away the simple meaning completely, it would be very hard to understand the Midrash. And the other thing is that problem with the Sanhedrin appearing as an explanation for 2 different things, I think shows us that the Midrash is not trying to give a one-to-one explanation. The Midrash is not trying to say A equals X, B equals Y, C equals Z. That's not what the Midrash is trying to do. It's just trying to kind of make associations, but it's not trying to kind of present a complete and thorough alternative narrative of what's going on. Okay, so that's my sense just from the Midrash, but don't trust me on it. Let's instead look at what the Mefarshim do with the Midrash. We're going to look at 2, at Rashi and Ibn Ezra, and let's see how they relate to the Midrash. So we'll start with Rashi. Rashi tells us right away, this is the very beginning of his introduction to Shir HaShirim, and right away he tells us what he thinks by quoting a pasuk. Achat diber Elohim, shtayim zu shamati. God said one thing, but I heard 2 things. One verse, I'm continuing in the English here, one verse comes out to many interpretations. Rashi tells us right away, Shir HaShirim has 2 meanings, and that's fine. God says things that can mean more than one thing. Shivim panim laTorah. Isn't that like a great thing about the Torah, that it can be interpreted in so many different ways? And then in case you didn't get it, he explains, but in the end, no verse may be removed from its pshat and its plain meaning. Even though the prophets said their words in parables, we first must explain the parable. Rashi is saying, I really think that this book is an allegory, but it is an allegory that is rooted in the pshat. We have to understand the simple meaning of the text in order to understand the allegory. The 2 of them, right? So that Rashi really believes that this is a book that is about divine love, that is about the relationship between God and the Jewish people. But in order to understand that story of the relationship of God with the Jewish people, we have to also understand the simple meaning, the simple story of human love, of the shepherd boy and the shepherd girl, in order to understand what the Midrash is saying. So the Midrash completely leans upon the pshat, and you really can't understand it without first understanding the pshat. Now, I think an even better proof of the fact that the Midrash is not meant to obscure or replace the simple meaning of the psukim is Ibn Ezra's commentary. Because what Ibn Ezra does is he actually interprets the entire book of Shir HaShirim, pasuk by pasuk by pasuk, with 2 complete interpretations, one according to the simple meaning and one according to the allegory. He actually says in his introduction that I gave you here that he interpreted it 3 times, but the first one is just like a word explanation, that he just gives word definitions. But then the second time is in accordance with its plain meaning, and the third time is according to the Midrash. And he really goes through. If you're reading Shir HaShirim, you get to Pasuk Bet, and he says, okay, here's what some of the words mean. Here's what the shepherd girl is saying to the shepherd boy, and here's what Bnei Israel are saying to God. And he really, throughout the book, goes through it and gives a complete interpretation so that you actually end up with two full interpretations. So you can really see there that according to the Ibn Ezra, Shir HaShirim is not either or. It can be both. So just to sum up what we said about the Midrash on Shir HaShirim. The Midrash on Shir HaShirim describes Shir HaShirim, understands Shir HaShirim as being a love story between God and the Jewish people. The dode, the male part, is God, and the ra'aya, the female part, is the Jewish people. But this allegorical interpretation of Shir HaShirim exists alongside the simple meaning of Shir HaShirim and was not intended by anyone other than ArtScroll to replace or obscure the pshat of Shir HaShirim. That's not what it's there for. So why is it there? I personally think that the allegorical interpretation of the love story between God and Bnei Israel is valuable to us as Jews. It's really good for us to have a biblical text about passionate love between God and Bnei Israel. Now, the prophets actually, in many places, use the husband and wife metaphor to talk about God and Bnei Israel, but it's usually they pull out that metaphor when the quote-unquote marriage between God and Bnei Israel is on the rocks. It's usually when the wife, Bnei Israel, has strayed by committing adultery, meaning idolatry, and the husband, meaning God, is punishing his wife, meaning Bnei Israel, for straying. So that's usually where this image comes up. And so it's an image that doesn't necessarily make us feel, closer to God or anything like that. But here, Shir HaShirim kind of rounds out that picture of our relationship to God. God isn't just our beloved husband when he's mad at us. There also is this song of love between us and God, and this kind of passion and adoration between us and God. And for that to be part of our religious worldview, I think just adds a lot to our religious lives. Okay, so we've talked about the simple meaning of Shir HaShirim, and we've talked about the allegory of Shir HaShirim. I want to talk about one place where I think that the simple meaning and the allegory converge to teach us something really, really exciting, I think. And that is, I want to really look at the issue of equality in Shir HaShirim. So what do I mean by that? You could argue that Shir HaShirim is the most female-dominant book in the Tanach. Usually we assume that distinction goes to either Megillat Ruth or Megillat Esther, but in fact, both Megillat Ruth and Megillat Esther start with a man and end with a man. Whereas in Shir HaShirim, the Ra'aya is the first one to speak at the beginning of the Megillah. She's the last one to speak at the end of the Megillah. She speaks more than the male character, and also her inner life is explored more than his. There are a couple of sequences of describing her dreams, and there aren't any explorations of his dreams and inner life. So feminist biblical scholars have noted all this, and one Bible scholar, Phyllis Tribble, presents a reading of Shir HaShirim as basically kind of the answer and the sort of compensation for the story of the sin of Adam and Chava in Gan Eden. If you think about it, Shir HaShirim presents a man and a woman in a beautiful garden of delights, like Gan Eden, where everything is blooming and the humans are in harmony with nature and with each other. And that is basically the state that Adam and Chava were in before the sin, living in Gan Eden. And she argues, Tribble argues, that in Gan Eden, that perfect harmony was introduced by sin, which then was interrupted by sin, which then introduced conflict and alienation, and that was also the point in which male dominance was introduced. So I'll show you just, I'll do a quick reading of the psukim according to Tribble. If you take a look on the left, there's Breshit before the curse. Adam and Chava have a relationship that is basically a perfect union. Adam sees Chava for the first time, and he says, Zot hapa'am etzem me'atzamai uvasar mi besari. This person is flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone, right? We're one, we're connected. And then it talks about how a man leaves his family, v'davak bi'ishto v'hayu lebasar echad. He clings to his wife and they become one flesh. Tribble says that Adam and Chava in Gan Eden is what the ideal relationship between man and woman is supposed to be. This relationship of love and of oneness and of equality. But then we get to the sin of Adam and Chava, and the curse that is given to Adam and Chava is inequality. The curse is that the woman is told, Ve'el ishech tshukatech v'hu yimshol bach. That now you're just going to be desiring your husband and he is going to be ruling over you. So that basically that is the moment where the world that we know, the patriarchal world that we know, in which men often kind of dominate over women, that is when it is introduced. That's not how it was supposed to be in creation, but that the sin then introduces that into the world. And that then you have Shir HaShirim, where they come back to the garden and where they have this relationship that is so equal, where she talks about how the woman says, Ani le dodi v'dodi li, or dodi li v'ani lo, all of these kind of descriptions of them as being completely mutual and completely equal. And even kind of the kicker is that she even uses the phrase, this is in the charts, Ani le dodi ve'alai chukato. I am my beloved's and his desire is for me, which is the flipping of the curse. The curse was that she would desire him and that would kind of be the thing that enabled him to rule over her. But that now the power has shifted. Now it is Ani l'dodi ve'alai chukato. He desires me. She says, Tribble says, it's not that now she's dominating him. It's that now it's mutual. And here's her description from her 1978 book. And this is her description of Shir HaShirim. Born to mutuality and harmony, a man and a woman live in a garden. This couple treats each other with tenderness and respect. Their love is truly bone of bone and flesh of flesh. Etzem me'atzamai uvasar mi besari. And this image of God, male and female, is indeed very good. V'hinei tov me'od. In this setting, there is no male dominance, no female subordination, and no stereotyping of either sex. So that's what Shir HaShirim gives us, is this kind of resolution of the problem of inequality that is introduced in Gan Eden, and kind of a way to return to that ideal equal state. Now, here's the thing about all of that equality. When you allegorize Shir HaShirim, when you turn it into a love story between God and the Jewish people, all of that exciting equality in which the woman is strong and there's mutuality, it doesn't go away, and it in fact becomes an even bigger deal. Once the man and the woman, who are equal to each other and who have this mutual and equal affection, are in fact God and the Jewish people, then the fact that the woman is strong and equal implies a certain amount of parity between humans and God, which is an even bigger deal than the equality of the sexes. And the rabbis totally notice this in the Midrash and talk about kind of the beauty of the mutuality of Shir HaShirim. In all songs, either he praises them or they praise him, right? That in general, in other places, the relationship between God and humans is hierarchical. Either he's kind of looking down on them and saying nice things about them, or they're looking up at God and praising him. In Moshe's song, they praise him, as it says, Ze Eli va'anvehu. This is my God, and I will enshrine him. That's in the Song of the Sea. In Moshe's song, in another place in the Torah, he praises them, as it says, Yarkivehu al bamoteh. He set him atop the high points of the land. Okay, so that's typically what happens in the Torah, says the Midrash. That usually it's one-sided. Usually it's kind of a one-sided relationship. But here, they praise him and he praises them. He praises them. Ah, you are fair, my darling. And they praise him. And you, my beloved, are handsome. Beautiful indeed. The rabbis see this moment of the raya and the dode looking each other in the eye and praising each other in a completely mutual way, and understand it in the allegorical fashion as something totally radical, that it's as if God and the Jewish people are no longer in a relationship of hierarchy, but are actually looking each other in the eye, so to speak, and sharing a moment of mutuality and unity. Okay, so that's kind of amazing and groundbreaking. And the other thing is that the allegorical equality of God and humanity, I think, also reflects back onto the feminist questions. Because in general, when the Tanach uses husband-wife imagery to describe God and Bnei Israel, that also has implications for what the marital relationship is. It implies that the marital relationship is unequal. It implies that our husbands are our lords and masters. But here in Shir HaShirim, where the God and Israel couple enjoys equality and mutuality, I think that that implies that so too can human couples enjoy that same equality and mutuality. So my personal conclusion about Shir HaShirim is that I'm actually a big fan of the rabbinic allegory. I think that the simple meaning of Shir HaShirim gives us a joyous and poetic language of love, but the rabbinic allegory gives us an exciting and potentially radical way of understanding our relationship to God and, by extension, also our relationship to each other. So thank you so much for joining me.
Very much, Channa. Hold on, I'm trying to, you see the questions. I'm trying to post these questions here to you. If you want, I can send them to you if you want to address them.
Sure. Yeah.
No, I just took them. I was sort of working on the ones that came from before, but they don't, for some reason, they won't go in the chat box. I don't know why.
Okay, do you want to just read them to me?
Yeah. Or should I email them to you? It's probably easier.
Actually, it might be easier if you read it to me, so I don't have to toggle back and forth.
Okay, so let me read them to you. Hold on, let me find them here. Okay, just give me 1 second. Very interesting. Okay, but Yeshikoach, thank you. Okay, I'll I'll have to do it this way. Okay, perhaps I'm jumping the gun, but a question that very much interests me is, does Shir HaShirim tell a story? You sort of alluded to that. If you want to, I don't know if you want to touch that at all.
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. So the truth is, there's a quote from Yair Zakovich that I really loved. I actually wrote it down, but I didn't say it. I'm going to pull it out here, where he says, he wrote it in Hebrew, but this is my translation into English. He says, Yair Zakovich, by the way, is an Israeli academic Bible scholar. And he says, the attempt to impose a continuous logical story upon the Megillah is baseless, requiring goodwill and bridging many gaps. Right, that's his take, meaning he says, like, anyone who makes it into a story is just trying really hard to make it into a story. It's not really a story. And I think that that's kind of the pervasive academic view of Shir HaShirim, is that it's more just a collection of poems and that it's not trying to be a linear story. Having said that, I think some of the Mefarshim do a better job than others of making it into a story. And so, he doesn't like their readings, but I do think that there are some attempts that are more convincing than others to tell it as a story. But I think that for sure we can agree that whether you can make it a story or not, that's not its main point. Like, its main purpose isn't really to tell a narrative. Its main purpose is more to make you feel a certain way.
Okay. A lot of people, I guess, at the beginning were commenting the switching back from the second and third person. Okay. Somebody wrote, the switch in person make me think of someone fantasizing.
Someone what?
Fantasizing.
Absolutely. So Shir HaShirim, first of all, Shir HaShirim has a couple of sections that are clearly dream sequences. There's a section in chapter 3 and a section in chapter 5 where she says that she says in a poetic way that she's dreaming, right? In one of them she says, Ani yeshena v'libi er, I am asleep but my heart is awake. And in the other one, she says, Al mishkavi baleilot bikashti et she'ahava nafshi. As I lay in bed, I searched for my love, and then describes how she goes searching for him. And so it's clear that it's all a dream. So there are these places where she explicitly says that it is a dream, but there also are places where it just kind of feels a little bit dreamlike. Even though it's not sort of explicitly labeled as a dream. One of the summaries that I read of Shir HaShirim described those first couple of psukim as a waking dream, which is exactly what you said, kind of a daydream, a fantasy. And that part of that all of these dreams and these dreamlike states, I think is this idea that that's kind of part of the experience of love, is that first of all, reality feels like a dream, but also that you're kind of dreaming about the person who you love, and you're kind of you're thinking about them both when you're awake and when you're asleep. And that sort of this, it's kind of bringing us into that dreamlike feeling.
Okay. All right. Somebody mentions why all of a sudden they mention kings and shepherds. Combine them with the next comment that the beloved is described as allegorically or otherwise as a king, when the first verse of Shir HaShirim attributed it having been written by a king. Okay.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I actually didn't address at all the fact that it starts with Shir HaShirim Asher Li Shlomo, and what that means. There's like really, even I actually was just learning with my son the Gemara in Baba Batra about who wrote the different Sfarim of Tanach, and even the Gemara doesn't say that Shlomo wrote Shir HaShirim, even though it says Shir HaShirim Asher Li Shlomo, meaning they don't actually see that as attributing authorship, but there are various allusions to Shlomo throughout Shir HaShirim, possibly because he's sort of this like ultimate sort of man of love, because he has so many wives, and there is this part that even talks about how Shlomo has so many wives, but there are various allusions to Shlomo, and it seems like he's more of a symbol than supposed to be an author or anything like that.
Okay, then somebody commented, switches from describing the beloved as male to female. Hayafa b'nashim, neshikot pihu, hamelech. I don't know if you want to. Okay.
Right. Yeah, I think there's just a lot of back and forth. I think usually you can tell who's speaking. Like usually, especially in the Hebrew where all of the language is gendered, I think there are very few psukim where it's actually ambiguous which one of them is speaking, but there are a lot of back and forths.
Okay, and then someone wants to know if you have any comments on Geula Tversky's thesis that Shir HaShirim is all about the Kruvim.
Okay, so I'm not familiar with that. I haven't seen it, but I will say that in general, there are a lot of allegorical interpretations of Shir HaShirim. This time we talked about the rabbinic interpretation, but there also is, I also mentioned the interpretation of it being about Eretz Yisrael, and there are other ones that I didn't even touch on about how it's about kind of the soul and the journey of the soul through the world, how it's about kind of the individual mystical relationship with God. So I think that Shir HaShirim, it kind of, especially because there's so much metaphor even in the plain meaning, it's just kind of ripe for interpretation in so many different ways.
Okay, so that's what someone's asking, the wine, the oil, the ointment, okay, the various types of metaphors we have. Okay, let's see what else we have here. If it's a metaphor for the land, why doesn't the text say her hair is a flock of goats instead of your hair is like a flock of goats? So I don't really understand that question. Okay, the ambiguity really creates this dreamlike reality that you addressed that already. Seems like I could talk about Art Scroll. They don't really want this to be a love poem, and the whole, of course, which you addressed. Art Scroll. Rashi sets up a base for much of the Midrashic material. Okay, in his intro, fine. Rav Adin Steinsalz, I'm assuming, unfortunately, Zatzal now explained that we needn't see Shir as one story. That's you were saying. He claims the Shir is also a link of chain, as in a sharsheret, that each link has significance in itself and completes the chain of narrative called Shir HaShirim. Okay, interesting.
That's beautiful. I like that.
Yeah, and then the last comment here, I see it as a beautiful and richly written allegory that helps us understand the relationship with God and also with the special person in our life. It works both ways to help us understand that sometimes there's wonder and appreciation, and sometimes it is hard to connect. And that is okay too, as long as we keep the connection, whether it's the religious connection to God or the loving marital relationship. Interesting comment.
Wonderful. That's a great place to end.
Okay, I want to thank you very much.